We have Dr. Matthias Winkenbach from MIT, Professor Stefan Spindler from the Otto Beisheim School of Management, and Alain Rosé from La Poste.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Ellen. Thanks to the entire prize committee. It's an honor for us to present our work on strategic redesign of urban mail and parcel networks. And the question that we will address in the next couple of minutes is, should the networks of mail and parcel, which are currently run as separate entities, should they be merged to address a number of challenges that La Poste is facing? Let me introduce our team. We have Matthias here of MIT and Alain of La Poste. Let me also put a little bit our work that we present today into perspective of one of the research streams pursued over the past couple of years. It started off with looking into the issue how electric vehicles could be introduced into La Poste fleet. And that was a Wagner Prize finalist in 2011 and led to the decision of La Poste to buy more than 10,000 electric vehicles, a decision which they have not yet regretted. With the fleet problem tackled, we could then move on to look at the design of the network, which gave rise to the next stage. The particular innovation in that approach is that we can solve distribution designs for realistic large-scale cities. And so speaking of France, that could be even Paris and is certainly including Lyon and other smaller cities. Right? And this paper is forthcoming in Transportation Science and is the methodological basis for what we're going to present today. As mentioned before, what we will do in the present presentation is to look at how the parcel and the mail network, how they could be merged, and whether they should be merged, and what the benefits of such a merger might be. Let me motivate a problem. Postal operators across the globe face issues, be it USPS, be it La Poste, be it Deutsche Post. Among them are declining mail volumes because of e-substitution, right? No one writes letters anymore, except maybe for reminders for paying your dues. Increasing competition, right? Because there's a liberalization going on with new players in the market, right? Also, crowd delivery models such as Uber is about to introduce. And last but not least, there's structural cost disadvantages just because of the legacy of the systems and also in terms of the universal service application. What does that mean? Postal operators have to take action. Right? And that means that they have to find new streams of revenue to compensate for ceasing revenue streams. They have to improve the cost position and improve operational efficiency. And we shall see later on that our work addresses all of these three issues. Let me give you two numbers about the two networks that we consider, namely the mail and the parcel network. So when we look at mail, we see that there's a significant decline. USPS reports a 1.4% of decline in 2010. For La Poste, it's even worse. It's minus 5.6% between 2012 and 2013. What is the consequence of that? Well, you can see this in the stylized distribution network that we have here, that what is in the future missing is this additional delivery point, which means that fewer items per stop, more stops per route, and an increase in average route length, and hence a declining route efficiency, and thus even increased cost. For the parcel network, it's quite the other way around. We do see an increase in parcel revenues, a substantial increase, which is primarily driven by the growth in e-commerce. What is the impact here on the delivery network? Well, we have an increasing stop density as opposed to a decreasing stop density. We have more items per stop, but also we see that the item size tends to be smaller and smaller, right? With consumers tending to buy only fewer items per delivery. And hence, smaller, more agile vehicles, such as bicycles, and we shall see that they are being used quite frequently, emerged. Right? So this is the motivation for our work, and let me now hand over to Matthias to explain what the model developed in this context does.
Thank you, Stefan. Oops, let's fix this. Thank you. So, welcome from my side too. So, in order to decide whether La Poste should in the future actually still operate two separate networks, one for mail and one for parcel, or whether these two networks should actually, at least in part, be merged, we needed to design a model that was able to depict the real complexity of a city first. So the complexity in terms of the geography, but more importantly, the complexity in terms of the distribution and the nature of the demand within that city. And an approach that we used to work with also in the previous work that Stefan mentioned was segmentation. So we basically, here you can see the example of the city of Nantes in the northwest of France. We divided the city into a large number of quadratic city segments. In this case, it was around 1,600. And for each of those city segments, we could first of all define kind of the overall demand level. So basically, the stop density, the number of stops that vehicles would have to serve per square kilometer. And as I said, each of these little squares is basically 500 times 500 meters. So there's a very high level of detail at which we can actually define the stop density. But we can go one step further and also define segment-specific probability distributions, for example, for the number of items that we have to deliver per stop, or for the size of these items. So at the end of the day, we are able to depict the current demand at a very detailed level. We can characterize it very well, but we can also characterize the changes of those demand characteristics throughout the different scenarios that we want to analyze for La Poste. So when we designed this model, we did not only want to apply kind of a simple single-tier network architecture to the distribution network that we wanted to be in place in the future. So we didn't want to only have a big consolidation center or maybe multiple consolidation centers somewhere at the outskirts of the city, but we wanted to leverage the concept of multi-tier distribution because in the end, what this concept of multi-tier distribution allows us to do is we can leverage the large carrying capacity of large vehicles and the high fuel efficiency for at least a large portion of the line haul distance between the consolidation points and the actual customers. But by including a second layer of deconsolidation, so basically transshipment points within the city, which we usually call intermediate depots, in the remaining literature it's sometimes called satellites or something. So by including the second layer of facilities, we could allow for transshipment from larger vehicles to smaller, more agile vehicles who could then more efficiently serve the actual last miles or serve the actual milk runs to the customers. And this might be very beneficial, especially when you think about very congested and very densely populated urban areas. So to allow for a model that could actually come up with a multi-tier network design if it is required, we basically, first of all, defined a certain set of candidate locations for facilities. So we let the model choose, using binary variables, at which locations within the city it would want to open up which kind of facility. So it could choose where it would locate a consolidation center. It could also choose where to locate those intermediate depots, so the transshipment points within the city. And then using another set of binary variables, it would then decide which part of the city, so which of those 1,600 city segments should actually be served from which facility and also using which kind of vehicle. Because in the case of La Poste, we were actually able to decide between 3 different vehicle types. One was the classical postman with his trolley. The second was a cargo bike, which La Poste is currently introducing in their daily postal operations. And the third is the classical postal van. Now, on the constraint side, the most important constraints that we considered were probably capacity constraints. So we considered capacity limitations both on the vehicle level and on the facility level. But more importantly, what is the objective of this whole model? Well, we're trying to minimize the daily total cost of operation of that distribution network, in this case for the city of Nantes, but also for the other cities that we considered. So those total costs of operation consist of various components, among them a routing cost, vehicle cost, facility cost, but handling cost. But the most critical part was actually routing cost, because we wanted to design a model that was not only applicable to a small-scale city or not only applicable to like a little part of a bigger city, but we wanted to design a model that could solve the network design problem on the entire city scale, and even for larger cities like Nantes, Lyon, or even Paris. So as you can imagine, if we had tried to figure out the routing cost by explicitly optimizing every single vehicle route within that city, the model would just not have been tractable and scalable. So we needed to come up with a different solution, and what we did was we developed a closed-form approximation formula for routing cost, and I will go into more detail on the next slide. The last thing that I wanted to mention here is that we implemented this as a mixed integer linear programming model, coded it using Python as a scripting environment and Groupe as kind of the high-end industrial solver in the background that would actually solve this model close to optimality. Now, I mentioned that we had to come up with some sort of approximation technique for the actual routing cost. And we built on an approach that was first developed by D'Aganzo in 1999, who started off by just considering the following situation. You have a facility somewhere and an area of demand somewhere else, and with some kind of vehicle, you want to serve that demand from that facility. And D'Aganzo basically started by just considering the distance that would have to be traveled between 2 stops along an optimal route within that area of demand. So he assumed that routing was already taken care of, that routing happened in an optimal way, and he was just interested in finding out how far do vehicles have to travel between 2 stops along an optimal route. He did that kind of defining the distribution of stops within that area of demand as a 2-dimensional point process, which is usually characterized by just a single parameter, which is gamma usually, and that's basically in a logistics setting, that's a stop density of that area of demand. And so he came up with a very simple expression, actually, this one here, k divided by the square root of gamma. So this was his solution for that distance between 2 stops along a route. Gamma, I already explained, that's the stop density, so the number of stops per square kilometer that needs to be served. And k is a factor that simply accounts for the true distance that the vehicle would have to travel, because in a city setting, you can't just go from A to B using the Euclidean distance. You have to take into account the detours that have to be made due to the actual road network, due to directionality of roads. And there's simulation techniques like the wing and sweep heuristic or the swath heuristic to actually come up with reasonable estimates for that k factor. So other authors, among them Smilowitz and D'Aganzo in 2007, who we mostly used as a basis for our work, used this approach and came up with estimates not only for the travel distance between 2 stops, but basically they came up with estimates for the overall distance and time traveled along an entire route, still assuming that it's already been optimized. So they wanted to see how far vehicles have to travel along an optimal route within a certain area of demand. And we expanded these approaches by kind of introducing, for example, vehicle-specific parameters. So for example, we introduced vehicle-specific speeds for certain parts of the route. We distinguished between line haul distances and inter-stop distances, for example. But we also accounted for vehicle and destination-specific carrying capacities, because the effective carrying capacity of a vehicle might actually differ depending on where it goes and from where it goes. And last but not least, we introduced what we call the global maximum service time, which is kind of a notion of service level. So that's basically the maximum time frame within the delivery service, within which the delivery service would have to be completed. And of course, the shorter that is, the higher the service level, if you wish. Now, classical approaches, amongst them the one that we developed in that previous project for La Poste, classical approaches in designing urban distribution networks try to apply either a single tier or a multi-tier distribution network design on the entire city. But we actually found out that this is not always the best thing to do, because there might be areas in the city that are most efficiently served directly from a consolidation center, so using just a single tier of distribution. Whereas other areas, mainly those that are further away from this consolidation center or that are in areas that are very highly congested and very densely populated, these areas might be more cost efficiently served using a two-tier network infrastructure. So we wanted to expand the existing approaches and to come up with a model that would actually allow for a mixed tier distribution network design. So the model should be able to decide on a city segment level which city segment should be served using a single or a two-tier network architecture. And that's what we did for this project. And also, we have to remember we're trying to merge, or we're trying to answer the question, does it make sense to merge two networks? But the items circulating within these networks are actually very different in size. So a lot of existing approaches just use, for example, expected values for drop size. But in this application, this would actually lead to false results, because once you mix items of different shape and size, just working on the basis of expected values will actually distort your results. So we used Monte Carlo simulation to come up with a more detailed description of, for example, drop size, by coming up with an actual probability distribution of the size of the items that need to be dropped. Then, last but not least, apart from all the, let's say, theoretical rigor of the model, we wanted to make this model usable and easily approachable, especially by the people who should use it on a daily basis at La Poste. So we basically designed, for example, an Excel-based user interface for this model. So the people at La Poste, even if they weren't entirely familiar with the mathematical details, could basically play around with the model, use it for sensitivity analysis, for scenario analysis, and use it in their daily business, use it using a framework like Excel that they were used to working with anyway. And we also supported the managerial decision-making at La Poste with a number of visualizations of the model results, because we didn't want to stop at just presenting the numbers. We actually wanted to give them an idea of how does the new network actually look like. And this is what we did here. I'll show you one of these visualizations in more detail in the following. So what did we actually try to find out? What are the scenarios that we looked at? We started off with a base case that's basically motivated by mainly historic data of La Poste. So again, here you see the three vehicle options that we considered: pedestrians, cargo bikes, and vans. And then we came up, for example, with the characterization of the mail and parcel volume that we want to consider, and also the characteristics of these volumes, like their size, the number of stops, and also the distribution of item sizes. That's all based on historic data. And diverging from this base case, we first of all defined two additional cases that were more taking into account changes in the demand structure. So the first case, the e-commerce case, is basically what La Poste thinks of its own business for, let's say, in 5 years or 6 years. So they expect their parcel business to increase further due to the continuous boom in e-commerce, and they expect that actually their mail business might decline quite significantly by up to 50%. Then we have the peak demand case, which is basically representing sort of the Christmas peak period, where La Poste traditionally has a more or less stable mail volume, but has almost twice the volume in terms of packages. And then we looked at more on the business case side of distribution networks. So one scenario that we defined was the express case, where we tried to find out how would our recommendation whether or not to merge those two networks actually change if we wanted to offer a higher service level, so if we wanted to offer a more speedy distribution. And the last case down there is, how would our recommendations change if we did not have those new cargo bikes in place, but if we had to operate on the existing old school postal bikes who actually have much less carrying capacity? In a nutshell, this is what we found. And one thing that needs to be noted here is that across all of the scenarios that I just described, the model actually suggests that financially it's definitely worthwhile merging the two networks entirely. So on the very left of this scale, you basically have the total cost of two entirely separate networks. On the very right of the scale, you have the total cost of one entirely merged network, and in between you have different shades of that. But as you can clearly see, all of these curves indicate that it's worthwhile merging those networks entirely. And the cost savings that we could achieve range from 3 to 7%, actually only in the standard bike case. So if we only have the old vehicle technologies to use, we see that the model results are kind of ambiguous. So the model basically tells us it doesn't really make a difference whether you merge or not. But since this vehicle technology is fading out anyway, we didn't think it was very relevant for us to consider. Now, this is just to give you an idea of what the model results could look like in terms of the numbers. So you see on the blue side of this chart, you basically see an illustration of the fleet composition that the model suggests. On the left side, you have two separate networks, one for mail, one for parcel. On the right side, you have one for the joint network. And the same thing here for the underlying facility infrastructure. So it tells you how many intermediate depots and consolidation centers would you need if you had two separate networks versus if you had a joint network. And what you can see here is that by merging those two networks, you put much more emphasis on those cargo bikes being used as a vehicle technology. So a lot of items that used to be served by pedestrians in the mail network or by vans in the parcel network actually are now being served in the joint network using cargo bikes. And on the network side or on the facility side, you see that we're moving away from a more granular mail network with up to 14 intermediate depots to a more centralized joint network with only 6 of these transshipment points. And similar findings could be found for the e-commerce case. Now, looking at kind of the visualizations of these results, this is how the mail network would look like in an optimal case if we had it entirely separated from the parcel business. So you see 2 yellow dots here. These are the locations that the model suggests for the distribution centers, for the consolidation centers. The red dots are the locations that the model suggests for those transshipment points that we want to use. And you see different shades of gray within this map of Nantes. And you see that there's a lot of segments that are still in light gray, which indicates that they should actually be served using pedestrians. Now, if we move on and merge those networks entirely as the model suggests, the picture changes a bit. You still see those 2 consolidation centers, but you see far less intermediate depots, so you see far less transshipment taking place. And you also see that fewer areas are served using pedestrians. Now, this is basically what we wanted to show in terms of the model results. There's much more, but we had to fit it in 30 minutes. But the general message is that, first of all, the model suggested it's definitely worthwhile to merge those 2 networks, so you should do it, and that's what La Poste eventually also did. And secondly, it went further than that and actually suggested to La Poste, you should not only merge it, but this is roughly how your new network should look like. And this was, I think, very important also to convince the top management at La Poste of that change. And with this, I would like to hand over to Alain. There you go.
So thanks, Matthias, and it's a great pleasure to be here to present the results and the consequence of this model. Other way, okay. So just one word about the model and these squares, small squares, about hundreds of meters wide. It's the size of the route of the postman, of the delivery route. So it's according to the delivery very convenient, 200 square at this moment. The figures was 500 squares by 500 squares, but now we are running 200 square by 200 squares, and we mixed postal data, but also census data and also geographical data coming from a geographical database. So we are running this model also for clustering. We don't present today, but we have done some geographical clustering of cities to understand clearly in other cities, the suburbs, what happens, and so on. So it's a very efficient model, and so we have some big results. It takes 2 years to be confident and to have trust in the results, because we are using clearly data coming from La Poste. We are using parameters coming from the measurement of the workload of the postman. We have 80,000 routes, and we measure the workload daily with parameters, the speed, times, and so on. So we reuse the same parameters in the model, but it takes 2 years to understand clearly that the results are confident and close to the reality. Now, the impact. So we changed the status of La Poste 20 years ago from agency, administrative agency, to a corporate, a company. And we was running with different business unit in France, very independent business unit, one for the mail, another one for the parcels, after the retail and bank. And this competition was interesting because we focused during 20 years the business unit on the market, customer needs. So we are proud today to keep about two-thirds of the market share of e-commerce. 70% of market share are owned by La Poste. It's not the same case with USPS, for instance, losing market share in parcels market. So we try to reduce the decrease of mail as it's possible, because internet is a big competitor. It's very difficult to compete. But we try with business unit focus on the market to clearly follow the customer and develop. But now it was, and you see the result, difficult to avoid economy of scale. And we decided last year, July of last year, to merge in the domestic operation the mail and the parcel. So after these first results, we decided to merge the management up to the city level, to be sure that with only one manager of Nantes, of Lyon, we are sure that after that, the result of this simulation can be put in place of the first line management. So during 6 months, and you have some picture, Lyon, for instance, switched in October last month, the last one, to the new organization. So it takes 6 months to implement the new management, and after that to explain to the local manager, to discuss, to explain with union that we need to change the organization. So Lyon is done, October, and first Angers, close to Nantes, and the first one was Nantes because it was the first simulation place, so more easier to explain to the city management that they need to change. And what kind of change? We don't take the optimum of cost, because the optimum of cost, sure, it's less costly, but we discuss also with marketing department, and we decide to keep a small dedicated network for parcels, because the merged network is common with mail and parcels. It takes about 5 hours window of delivery, and during the day, between 9 and 15 p.m., 3 p.m. So difficult to reach the people at home during this window, because French people are working. So we deliver the mail, because they are letterbox, the small parcels, because our letterbox are quite wide, it's possible to deliver the small parcels directly. And we keep a small network, 3 hours of window between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. for the large parcels, and parcels with signature, because we need to get somebody at home. So we don't choose the optimum of cost, because it choice to mix this customer approach and only cost reduction. So now, biggest discussion with union is to shift some people from the morning delivery to the evening delivery. It's less convenient to do your job at the end of the day, or a lot of postmen prefer to do the job in the morning and to go at home after, and to be ready to do something after the job. So discussion, but now we have 10 cities running tests and close to switch to the new organization. And the big deal is Paris, perhaps next year, because it's more complex city, more complex discussion with union. So we try to avoid to discuss first with the people, the postmen of Paris. So very interesting approach. Modelization is important in the delivery because it's impossible to measure. If you test something, real test, it's very difficult to measure the difference of efficiency because we are speaking about 3%, 5%, 7%. There is no big disruption in the delivery networks. So very difficult because when you test in between, you change the traffic, you change some parameters. It's very difficult to compare efficiency before and after. So the modelization is the only way to prove that your organization is more efficient after than before. So I will perhaps give the microphone to Stéphane to conclude.
Okay. So let me wrap things up, what we learned throughout the process. First of all, we found that the significant benefits suggested by the model and experienced by La Poste, you saw the pilots and the already realized organizational changes. Of course, there are some limitations to the model. For instance, as we showed, right now we only consider cost minimization. There might be other objective functions which are equally reasonable. For instance, reducing the carbon footprint, which is a big issue in Europe, or maintaining a certain service level. Moreover, we do not capture uncertainty yet, right? So there's still further things to do in terms of modeling, which I think is good news. Lessons learned. First of all, we saw the different scenarios that were considered. There was a high level of robustness with respect to the results. That came a little bit of a surprise to us, actually, that results turned out to be as Matthias explained. The second item I would like to mention is that it might seem that the 3 to 7% of cost savings are relatively modest. However, as Alain mentioned, there's not much of disruption possibility that La Poste has. And in the distribution network, a kind of sector or a business, 3 to 7% is a rather big savings. Right? And last but not least, this OR model allowed us to quantify a benefit which otherwise would not have been quantifiable, and hence give the top management of La Poste a good argument in hand to convince their employees and to turn the organization into a new one, as we saw here. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions.